I am the chess strategist, and today we're going to win another chess game. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of our 10 plus 5 rapid speedrun. In our last game, we had a very positional game where our opponent weakened a key square in the center of the board, and we were able to exploit that weakness and convert a winning advantage. Today, we're hoping to get another game like that or to see another opening. So I am super excited to get into this. Let's just get right into it. And of course, we have been playing pretty much exclusively e4 with white, and we've been playing the Sicilian and the Grunfeld slash King's Indian with black. We are playing How Apollo Faccinal, and we're going to play e4 again. e4 has been our move of choice. It's just very direct and leads to very open positions. And our opponent does play e5 in response, and we are going to be playing knight f3 as well. Continue with knight f3. Opponent may respond with knight c6, and they do. So on Lichess, I feel like a lot of opponents play e5 and knight c6. So we are going to just continue with our Italians. We love the Italian. This bishop is a great piece. It creates pressure. And our opponents are always so afraid of this knight attack that they end up making this h6 move early, and they end up being very careful when they play against us. So we get to make the attacking moves, and they get to defend. So, of course, they respond with one of the main options, knight f6, and we respond with the main response, d3. And in this game with the Italian, I'm going to try to strike with d4 as soon as possible. Striking with d4 is a very prudent option in these positions. You get a very strong opening where you just end up winning because you're the one who gets to make the first strike. Your opponent is making defensive moves, you're making attacking moves, and when they make one small mistake, they're unable to really defend. So here, our bishop is being attacked, and we don't want to lose the bishop. So one thing we can do is he's not covered this square, we can go to that square. And he may knock us back with a6 or a6 b5 or anything like that, but he's going to create a lot of weaknesses in his camp by doing that. We're not super worried about any of this. The exchange of pieces here, like this bishop is of course a strong piece in the Italian, but there are other considerations that our opponent must make. And he expands, he wants to take, he's going to open up the file for our rook, which I'm actually very happy about, and now this pawn is weakened. Now there's a few ways for him to defend this pawn. One way is with d6, which is going to leave this pawn pretty much permanently weak. Or he can develop his bishop, which would kind of just block this bishop in forever. This bishop is not really going to get out behind this pawn chain. So we can see here that, yes, he has taken our bishop, and our bishop was a strong piece. But there have been other considerations that are more important in this position. Now here we have a very interesting move from our opponent. He decides to go with bishop to c5, trying to develop this dark square bishop as fast as possible. And he's left this pawn hanging. Now I'm not sure if this pawn is for sure capturable. I'm not sure if this is capturable, but let's just calculate. We can take with the knight, and does he have any moves with tempo that can get rid of it? Well, he can redevelop his bishop, but he loses a tempo by doing that. This pawn isn't hanging, so there's no fork. So I'm thinking this pawn is just hanging. And we can take it. This pawn is well defended in the center of the board by this pawn chain, and we're going to be able to negate his pressure. If he does go for this move, we can take. And yeah, if he tries to create any sort of pressure, we're going to be able to respond to it. I think he just forgot about this pawn in the center of the board that was hanging. And it's a very common kind of mistake. People move their pieces without understanding the jobs that they were taking. And yeah, this seems to be a pretty simple game from here. Well, one thing we want to do is we want to castle. We want to move our rook over to e1, and we want to play d4. Those are our immediate plans. Another thing we could do is develop our knight to c3 instead of developing our knight to d2 like we normally do in the Italian. And when we do develop our knight to c3, we have to be wary of this move b4. b4 knocking our knight away, which could potentially, if we do play d4, knock away a key defender of the pawn on e4. So we have to keep that in mind. Our queen may just stay here for now. Our queen could come out to f3, or she could come out all the way to h5 if this knight ever moves. And yeah, it seems like we have a very smooth game here. Our opponent definitely has made a blunder. He's let us get this nice pawn in the center, and he's contemplating his options. Now, one plan I do see that's immediate is we can develop our queen to f3 and decide to pin this knight and create a lot of pressure along the file and the diagonal here. That would be an excellent idea. But if our opponent just castles immediately, they can move their queen away. We're not super worried. He shouldn't be super worried about that. But what we do have is the opportunity to advance our pawn as well. So one thing we can do is develop our bishop, move the knight somewhere with tempo, and then have the tactic pinning the knight and attacking the pinned piece. Sort of like this piece is forking, pinning the knight down, and this piece is coming to just pick it off, you know. This bishop's holding it into place, and the pawn's coming to pick it off. So I know this is a lot of arrows, but we're sort of having an idea of where we want to put our pieces. And yeah, when we have an idea of where we want to put our pieces, we can start planning. Okay, this is where this piece is going to go. This is the ideal placement for this piece. And that allows us to get all our pieces out to great squares. So opponent decides to attack our knight. He wants to gain a tempo by developing his queen to c7, which is kind of an interesting square to develop your queen to in this opening. It's not great, really. And I think his plan is he wants to play this move, knight to g4, putting another attacker on this pawn here. Again, we're going to have a defender with a knight here on f3, so we're going to drop our knight back. And he's going to try maybe knight to g4. I think that could be his idea, which we can respond to simply just by castling. Of course, we are going to have a lot of different options in this position. One of them being eventually just advancing d4 and then e5, completely blocking out the influence of the bishop and the knight. It's going to be knocked out of the center. So those are some of our plans. Of course, we can advance d5 or e5 just immediately. But when that e5 pawn advances and we don't have enough defenders and we're not able to support it, it's not really that strong of a pawn. It just gives a one-move threat of knocking away the knight and weakening squares. Alright, so here our opponent is making a dual threat. The dual threat is on this pawn, there's two attackers. And on this pawn, there's also two attackers. So what we can do is just castle. And now we have a king defending this pawn. And a knight, so two attackers. Two defenders, and we also have two defenders on this pawn. So again, we're not worried about any of these attacks. If our opponent does try to exchange his the rook for two pieces, we will gladly go for it. We will give him our rook for two pieces because those are his two only developed pieces, except for the queen, of course, but queen doesn't really count. And he's going to be trading that for a rook that just barely castled. That rook is not really a strong piece in the mid game until you get it to an open file. But these pieces that he has are incredibly active, creating a lot of pressure, and we'd love to get that trade. That's an excellent trade for us, and we'll take it any opportunity we get to exchange off his active pieces for our less active ones. Alright, so here our opponent decides that he is interested in attacking our h2 pawn again. And here's where we can just play the move h3, knocking away the knight. That is one thing we can definitely do here. h3, knocking away the knight. His knight can go here to this square, but we can just take and drop our king over. And since the bishop is in front of the queen, it's not that strong of a battery. The battery is stronger with the queen in front because the queen can give a lot more checks than the bishop can. So we're going to knock away this knight. We're going to see where it has to go. If his knight goes back to f6, then there's a few different ideas. And if his knight goes to here, which it can go to, h2, we can move our rook over, or we can exchange knights. We're probably going to exchange knights and then just move our king to h1. And this bishop here isn't really a great piece. It's going to be able to be blocked off by this move g3, and we're going to be able to get our queen into the game very quickly, creating a lot of pressure and really making this bishop's placement weak. And he's not really developed his pieces. He's neglected his king side in order to play it as aggressive as possible on us. And we're going to show him that when you just make unfound attacks, there's no development and there's no solid plan. There's no advantage. You just end up giving your opponent free tempo to develop their pieces, and the position may not develop to your advantage. So here he's contemplating where to put his knight. I think knight h2 would be consistent with our opponent's efforts so far, to just play as aggressive as possible and try to make our position as uncomfortable for us as possible. But that's all it might be, is uncomfortable. We're not losing. We're not worried. Just because your opponent is attacking you doesn't mean that you're losing. A lot of the time, your opponents will go for attacks and they'll fail. And then when the attack fails, then you get to a point where your opponent's going to lose a ton of pieces and their attack is just going to be useless. Like, they lose all their pieces, they don't have an attack anymore, and then you're winning. So here he drops his knight back to e5, threatening the trade. Now, would the trade be bad? Well, the trade he'd take, then we take with the queen, and then he can give a check. But the check is not really that big of a deal. I'm not super worried about it. I'm not concerned in the slightest about that attack. Now, one thing we could do is we could advance d4. And if our opponent takes, we take back. And we're threatening then e5. Which would shut off the connection between the queen and the bishop if he was to give the check. That's an interesting option. The other thing e5 does is it's just opening the line with the king. We want his king in the center of the board to be able to be exploited as soon as possible. So I'm thinking d5 or d4 is just kind of the prudent move. Striking in the center, saying, hey, you're playing on the sides of the board, you're trying to attack us, but there's no attack here. We're not scared of any of your BS, and we're just going to go for an attack of our own in the center of the board. Open up the center of the board, put our rook in the center, and develop our pieces actively, because you're going to have a hard time defending your king. So let's just go with d4. I think d4 is a very prudent move to make in this position. Just saying, hey, your knight cannot stay there, and if you move your knight without any tempo, we're just going to play e5 and shove this bishop out forever. Completely shut it out, when we're going to follow it up with c3, creating a long pawn chain in the center of the board. Now, if he takes here with the check, of course, we're going to have to take back with the queen. But again, he has this threat, which is useless. And we're threatening e5. And here he allows us to play e5. Now we have a few questions. Do we play e5? Is there a better move? What do we do? Well, here I'm most certainly thinking e5 is the best move. We're blocking off the influence of the battery. And do we want this pawn to be exchanged? Yeah, kind of. This pawn is just blocking the file that we want to exploit on his king. So do we want to exchange this pawn? Yes. Like if he moves his bishop to whatever square, probably e7 would be the square I would go to, because it blocks the file. Yeah, and he does go to e7. But even if he does do this, like this kind of exchange could only be favorable for us. This exchange is only favorable for us. There's no way it's bad, because we are just opening up the center of the board, and our king is not in the center of the board. His king is in the center of the board. So there's a few logical follow-ups here. One follow-up I like is just rook e1. Rook in the center of the board on the file, restricting his pieces. Sounds great to me. What's another idea that we have? Well, we can develop our knight. To this square, and now our knight does have this excellent e4 square to use. So if we develop our knight here, then he might play this move d6, trying to threaten our pawn chain, and we want to make sure we have more defense. So I'm actually just going to play Rook E1 immediately. Rook E1 just cannot be a bad move. Aligning the Rook on the same file as the King, and he's going to want to take a temple to castle here for sure. He's going to castle at some point, and he does. He says, I'm not liking that the Rook is on the same file as my King. We are going to be castling, and I think that is most certainly my opponent's one of his best moves, if not his actual best move. And here I'd like to develop our knights. To what square, I'm not sure. Let's just develop our knight to c3 immediately. It's the most active square I can think of. Of course, these pawns are kind of restricting the knight, but we can maneuver our knight. That's the great thing about knights, is they can be redeployed. This knight can come around like this, down and up to this f5 square, which is nice in the Italian, or it can exploit a lot of squares in the center of the board if our opponent decides that he is not interested in doing. Okay, so here our opponent decides to go for this, kind of just pitting our knights, but his bishop has moved so many times. He's wasted a lot of tempo with his bishop, and we can reclaim this diagonal now. Now this diagonal here has been kind of weakened. We can claim the diagonal with our bishop, and there's also just a few other things we could do. I'm not super worried about that development of his bishop. It's just not a great square in general. Like, if he takes, then okay, he's helping us improve our pawn structure, sorta, you know? Our pawns are probably better like that than they were the other way. One thing I'm noticing is we can break with d5. If we break with d5, then we soften his pawns. We get this weak pawn in the center here. Take, take, take. We're threatening a fork here. But we do have a weak pawn in the center of the board, and we are allowing his bishop to develop. I like it. Let's go for it. Let's break in the center of the board. Here he might throw in the exchange. Alright, and here he's decided to create some pressure against our pawn here. But we can wedge our pawn even further up to d6. Wedge our pawn completely into his position. Create a strong attack against his queen he's going to have to respond to. And yeah, I don't really know what our opponent's doing. He's allowing us to get a lot of moves with tempo. A lot of strong attacks. His pieces are very, very weak. And I don't think, or I think our opponent is kind of losing the plot here. Okay, so now there's two attackers, two defenders. And we can continue to just advance our pieces. He's going to have a hard time developing this bishop. His queen has been rendered to a very, very, very weak square over there on the side of the board. And we can develop our pieces with a lot of tempo. First thing I'm seeing is we can jump our queen right up to the center of the board here and put an attack on his bishop. Now, granted, he can play this move, but then we can jump our queen here to the center of the board and create a double attack on this pawn. No. Let's be patient here. First thing we could do, develop our queen. Queen is a strong piece, and we can lift it to a different square. We don't have to lift it up here. We can lift it to a different square if we've decided that we want to put it on more active square. He's probably going to play this move, c5, which is a move I want to encourage. Wow, okay, and he goes for this other move, a5, to defend his bishop. Okay, a5 is interesting. And here, let's just develop our bishop to d2. We want to be able to move this knight away with tempo. Again, we like the exchange here, defending our weak pawn. Now, it is a weak pawn, yes, but this pawn is strong. This pawn is our weakness, yes, but we have a strong pawn. And our opponent has a lot of weaknesses. Mainly this bishop. This bishop is very weak. He's going to have to exchange it eventually, or we're going to be able to move our knight and trap his bishop, which would not be good for him. He doesn't want to lose his bishop, and we're getting very low on time here. This game may become a time scramble very quickly. We've got 114, and he's got 108. So we're going to have to play very quickly here so we can maintain the balance, and we're not worried about losing on time. Opponent here decides that he is interested in advancing his h6 pawn, kind of just hanging his knight a little bit out to dry. I mean, his knight's going to have one less defender. Kind of a weakness we can exploit as well. Again, I'm not too worried. One thing we can do is just drop our rook here to the center of the board, creating another defender on this pawn. And we're going to move our knight to the center of the board very quickly after this. Our knight will be going to e4 here, and we want to exchange these bishops. Okay. And here, knight goes to e4. And he's going to take. If he takes our bishop, what do we respond with? Well, we're going to take with the rook. We want to lift our rook up. Okay, and here our opponent decides to move his queen over. Kind of an odd move in my mind. I'm just going to take bishop here. He's going to take our queen most likely. And here I think he's missing a tactic. His idea is to take. Oh no, he's not. Okay, never mind. He's not going to go for the tactic. We have a few strong moves here. One strong move I'm seeing is just this excellent move, knight c5, creating a double attack on his bishop and his pawn, and revealing the defense of a pawn here, and also creating another attack on his knight on f4. So he's got a lot of pieces to defend in this position. And I think we might have him here. This is a very strong move, revealing an attack. And he's decided to defend with his knight. And we are going to drop our knight back. Or drop our rook. We're going to drop our rook to d4 so that his knight is not creating any sort of attack anymore. And now we are going to take the free pawn that we've been given. And we now have a pass pawn in the center of the board. that we can exploit. And our plan is going to be very, very simple. We drop our knight back, and we're going to advance our pawns eventually. And here we're going to advance this pawn, attack the knight. We want to knock this knight away. We want to disallow it, this strong square in the center of the board that it's had for the past couple moves. And now we can actually just advance our pawn here. And create more pressure on this bishop. And here he has blundered. We can take a rook. And take a rook again. And his king's going to drop. And we can go here. And here we are going to be able to win the game. It's going to be a very clean conversion here from now on. We want to take and fork with the rook. And here we take. Create an attack on his knight. And we're just going to advance our pawn. Create another attack. Advance our pawn again. And he gives up his knight for the pawn. We're going to see here the method of winning is going to be very, very simple. We are going to take. And we can pre-move most of this. We are going to drop our rook over here. Drop to cut off the king. And we're just going to advance our pawns. Drop our rook to defend his square. We can just take here. And just keep advancing. And he only has king moves now. We can give this check. Give this check. And just keep giving checks. We don't want to stalemate him, of course. We want to give him a move. And we have a lot of time here because we do have the increment, so we don't have to worry about him just checkmating us or getting stalemated or anything like that. We just want to make sure we give him a square. So here we give him a square he can move to. And now we are going to move our rook over, and he's going to have this square, and then we're going to move our rook over and checkmate him. And that's checkmate. So let's go over this game pretty quickly. I feel like we had a very strong game where we were able to attack and more like counterattack. Our opponent created an attack on us immediately. This was pretty interesting move he played here. Knight to a5. Knight at a5, of course, creates an attack on our bishop, and this bishop he can win it. Of course he can win it. As you can see here, he makes a lot of weakening pawn moves, and these pawn moves are bad because they restrict his bishop. When you move this pawn forward, it makes it harder to advance this center break, because now this pawn's going to be weak, especially when we get an open file like this. We're able to just run in and exploit. We're going to have all these squares to access with our rook immediately. Our rook is an active piece in the game. So he's exchanged his developed piece for our developed piece, but we get an open file. He gets what he would call a favorable trade. It's a favorable trade, yes, but we can transform the pawn structure so that we get a strong piece as well. So he develops his bishop actively here to c5, giving up the pawn in the center of the board. And his idea is very simple. We're going to give a pawn, and we're going to get an attack. And that's a lot of the time how gambits work. Have you ever heard of a gambit? It's when you give up material usually just a pawn, sometimes 2 pawns, or sometimes even a piece. You give him material so you can get an attack. And here that's what our opponent does. He gives up his pawn, and he gets his queen to this diagonal, and now he's got an attack on this pawn after this move. It's not a strong attack yet because we have 2 attackers, 2 defenders, so he can't actually take. But if he moves his bishop like he does get an attack on the pawn. Now, here we actually have to just be very concrete about the threat. What's the threat? Well, when his queen was like this, there was a lot of threats. If we didn't defend, if we didn't put our knight on c3, he could actually just, and we castle into it, he could checkmate us if the queen was in front. But here, since his bishop is in front, the only threat is to take this pawn with check and force our king to move. So we notice that the threat here is the winning of material, not actually the check. The check isn't that dangerous. Check, we just move our king over, and his bishop is going to be kind of stranded. We can close it off with g3 and eventually win it if he doesn't move his bishop in time. So here we advance h3 because we want to avoid the loss of the pawn. And he has a few options here. He could have gone to h2. I didn't think that would be a good option though because of this line, where he takes and we take. He goes on there, we take. He takes, we move our king over, and here we're just ready to basically win the bishop. We're going to play g3 and then win the bishop. And he's just going to have to drop it back, and we can end up exchanging the bishops. And really, he hasn't gotten anything, and we're up a pawn. So up a pawn is winning in most positions. Here he drops his knight back. I think this move is a lot better, creating a lot more dynamics in the position. And we decide to advance with d4, saying, get your knight out of the center. And this is a good move because it forces the issue to him. He's attacked us, and now we want to attack him right back. And d4 is the best way to do that, enabling us to get our pawns rolling in the center of the board and opening up the center of the board for our rook's influence on the e-file. So d4 is a nice move here. And our opponent kind of plays a weak move, kind of passive move, knight to g6. I think taking would have been better. Because if you don't want to be attacked, one idea you can do is you want to exchange your pieces. If you exchange pieces off the board, there's less pieces in your opponent's attack, and the opponent's attack is less likely to be effective when there's less pieces. So he could have exchanged, and I think that would have been a good idea for him, forcing our queen to come out. Of course, our queen's developed, but he's still got the lead in development, and we haven't really consolidated our pawn structure yet. We're not winning any tempo yet either. When these pawns start rolling, we win a lot of tempo. Other pieces have to move, and you get a lot of moves to do things that you want to do. So here he drops his knight back, which is a move that doesn't really do anything. This knight isn't effective on g6 right now, at least. And so he's kind of wasting a turn with that, and then also we get to advance with e5 and waste another one of his turns with a move that we want to make anyway. And he drops his bishop back to e7, which I think is probably the right square for his bishop. It's just distracting. It's keeping the influence of the rook minor because it's blocking the file. So we develop our rook to e1 where it should go, and he castles because he says I don't want none of that. I don't blame him. We develop our knight, and he decides he wants to attack our knight. Now here, a lot of time when people get pinned, they get nervous, and pins make them feel uncomfortable. But here we gotta notice: is this pin bad? Well, not really. This pin is not very strong. One, because if he takes, there's no big deal. This knight doesn't have any immediate job. It's not defending anything. It's just kind of covering some center squares. It's not really on its final destination anyway, because this pawn is kind of restricting it. So this knight isn't great. We're not worried about it being pinned. It's not defending anything. And if he takes, then we kind of improve our pawn structure. This pawn gets a defender. It's not a great pawn structure, but it's not terrible either. So we're not super worried. But we decide to break in the center and say, you know what? Fight us. We want to move this knight with tempo and create an attack on his queen and do all sorts of stuff like that. And we want to be able to play this move with tempo. So this is a move that just says, fight me. You decided to attack me, and now I'm going to attack you right back. And he decides that he doesn't want to fight us. He just wants to create more pressure in the center of the board, create an attack on our pawn, try to win it. But we can advance our pawn and create this powerful pawn wedge. Now, one thing that this wedge does is, first of all, it prevents this pawn from advancing. So he's never going to develop his bishop along this diagonal now. Yikes. His bishop has to be fianchettoed. And for him to fianchetto, he's going to have to move his bishop, and then he's going to have to play this move when it doesn't hang this pawn. That's the key thing. This pawn can hang. So he has to drop his queen back. We get that tempo, and we get to develop our queen. Here he plays a5. I think c5 would have been better, but a5 is fine. I think he just didn't want to give up this central square, this key d5 square, which we saw in the last game how weakening a square like d5 can be kind of losing for an opponent. So I understand why he didn't want to weaken that square. But we develop our bishop, and he makes an aimless pawn move, and here we're getting both low on time, so he's very cautious with his moves. He's not trying to make any drastic moves that could lose him the game. And we just keep developing our pieces simply. Rook to the center of the board. We develop our knight to a better square. And he goes for this queen exchange, which I think, in hindsight, I think he could have played it a lot better. I think he could have gone for a better exchange, but he didn't go for the critical move order. I thought the critical move order would be to take, but I think here's what he saw. He saw this and he didn't like this very much. I don't know why he didn't like this, but this looks great to me. This tactic doesn't work because the pawn does defend the rook. So I don't know why he didn't go for that. But he decided to go his knight to f4 here, which I think is just not a great move. Now, we did find this amazing move, knight to c5, creating an attack on his bishop, as well as attacking this knight like this. But he does find the best response. I believe knight to d5 is the best response. We move our rook, and we are still winning a pawn after that. We win the pawn, and from here it's pretty simple. We have an idea. This pawn is a passed pawn now. We want to advance it up the center of the board, and he's decided, oh wait, that's a passed pawn, I need to defend it. So he's defended the square twice. We want our rook to be influential on this file, so we knock the knight away. His knight goes back, we advance the pawn, and we notice here that we can apply pressure on the file immediately. So we don't have to move our rook and then go. We can first advance our pawn, then his piece goes on the square, and then we can put our rook. Here we're doing it with a lot of tempo, and we're just winning a piece because this bishop is just pinned, and there's no way for him to defend it nicely. He can defend it with his rook here, but we can attack it again. We can bring our knight into the center of the board. There's all sorts of things we can do here to create more pressure on this bishop, and eventually we're just going to win it. Here he just blunders immediately by moving his bishop and revealing the rook as being attacked twice and only defended once. And here we exchange all the pieces off, exchange the pawns, fork, and here it's just a method of conversion. We advance our pawn until our opponent has to trade his piece for it. We put our rook on a defended square, and we trade off our knight just so the pawns aren't going to be able to move together. And he's just got this one pawn that's not able to advance, and we just checkmate him. Granted, I wasn't very clean with the checkmate, but yeah, we ended up checkmating him, and that's kind of the game, guys. I feel like we had a very interesting game here. We played with the theme of the counterattack, and I think that's the theme of this game, is that when your opponent attacks you, when it's unfound and they give up material, you just have to defend for a few moves. Find very critical moves, and you will be able to weather the storm, and your attack will come quickly and much stronger than theirs. So, yeah, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video. I had a great time making it, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.